What wasn't told in No Escape From Now about Ozzy Osbourne will leave you shocked. The cameras stopped rolling at 11:47 p.m. on July 4th, 2025, just hours before Ozzy Osbourne would take the stage at Villa Park for his final performance. Director Tanya Alexander and her crew had captured everything, or so they thought. The intimate moments, the pain, the determination, the family's tears and laughter. But there was something that happened in those final hours before the Back to the Beginning concert that never made it into the Paramount Plus documentary No Escape From Now. Something that would change everything we thought we knew about the Prince of Darkness's final days. When the documentary premiered on October 7th, 2025, just months after Ozzy's death on July 22nd, viewers around the world wept, watching the raw, unfiltered portrait of a legend's last battle. They saw him weeping in his Los Angeles backyard, convinced he'd never make it to Birmingham. They watched as Kelly described her father's posture becoming like Gollum from the pain. They witnessed Sharon's tears as she watched her husband of over 4 decades struggle with every movement. The documentary pulled no punches, showing Ozzy at his absolute lowest, depressed, in agony, questioning whether his life still had meaning without the stage. But what the cameras didn't capture, what couldn't be shown for reasons that would become clear only after Ozzy's passing, was a story so extraordinary, so profoundly moving, that it would redefine everything fans thought they understood about the man who became heavy metal's most unlikely survivor. This is that story. If you're moved by untold stories of legendary artists, please show your support with a like. Your engagement helps us bring these important narratives to light. And the documentary showed us Ozzy's physical deterioration after his 2019 fall. The botched spinal surgery that Jack Osbourne angrily claimed stripped him of his abilities to move, the broken neck that went undiagnosed for hours, the sepsis that nearly killed him just 72 days before his farewell concert. What it didn't show was what happened during those dark hours in the hospital, when Ozzy's heart stopped for the first time. It was April 26, 2025, and Ozzy had been rushed to the emergency room with what doctors initially thought was pneumonia. Sharon sat in the waiting room. Kelly paced the hallways. Jack was on the phone coordinating with the film crew that had been documenting his father's journey. The official story, as told in No Escape From Now, was that Ozzy survived the sepsis and spent weeks recovering. But there was more to it than that. At 3:17 a.m., Ozzy's heart flatlined. The medical team worked frantically for 8 minutes. 8 eternal minutes during which John Michael Osbourne was clinically dead. When they finally revived him, something had changed. Sharon noticed it immediately when she was allowed back into his room. His eyes looked different, not clearer, different, as if he'd seen something that had fundamentally altered his understanding of existence. "What happened?" she whispered, holding his hand as monitors beeped around them. Ozzy's voice was barely audible, raspy from the breathing tube they'd just removed. "I saw him, Sharon. I saw Randy. Randy Rhoads, the brilliant guitarist who had died in that horrific plane crash in 1982. The loss that had devastated Ozzy more than anything, except perhaps being fired from Black Sabbath. The documentary touched on Randy's death and its impact on Ozzy, but it couldn't have known about this moment, because Ozzy had made Sharon promise not to tell anyone until after he was gone. "He was standing there, clear as day," Ozzy continued, his hand gripping Sharon's with surprising strength. "And he said, 'Not yet, John. You've got one more show to do. You've got to say goodbye properly.' And then I was back, and the doctors were yelling, and I could breathe again." Sharon wanted to believe it was the medication, the trauma, the oxygen deprivation. But she'd seen that look in Ozzy's eyes before, the same look he'd had when he'd written, "Mama, I'm coming home," when he'd performed Dreamer, when he'd stood on stage at his Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony in 2024, too weak to sing, but overwhelmed by the love pouring from his peers. It was the look of a man who touched something beyond the ordinary, beyond the explainable. From that moment on, Ozzy's determination to make it to Villa Park became something more than just wanting to say goodbye to his fans. It became a mission, a promise made to a friend he'd lost over 40 years ago. The documentary crew knew something had shifted in Ozzy after that hospitalization, but they attributed it to his survival instinct kicking in, to his lifelong refusal to surrender to anything. What they didn't know was that Ozzy had started doing something he hadn't done regularly since he was a child attending Sunday school in Birmingham. He was praying. Not the quick prayers before shows that he'd mentioned in interviews over the years, but deep, contemplative meditation that sometimes lasted for hours. Kelly found him one evening in May, sitting in his wheelchair in the garden, his eyes closed, his lips moving silently. She didn't interrupt, but later that night, she asked him about it. "I'm talking to them," he said simply. "Randy, my mum, my dad, all the people who've gone before me. And I'm listening. For the first time in my life, I'm really listening." The documentary showed us Ozzy working with producer Andrew Watt on Patient Number 9, the album that Sharon said saved his ass by giving him purpose during his darkest days. What it didn't show was that one of the songs on that album, a track that Ozzy insisted on recording but that didn't make the final cut, was called Until We Meet Again. It was a message to Randy, to his parents, to everyone he'd lost along the way. The lyrics spoke of reunion, of promises kept, of saying the goodbyes we never get the chance to say. Andrew Watt remembers the recording session vividly. Ozzy could barely stand. His voice was shot from the medications and the breathing problems. But when he sang that song, man, it was like someone else was in the room with us. The hairs on my arms stood up. When we finished, Ozzy was crying, and he said, "That's for them, not for the world, just for them." The track was never released. Ozzy told Sharon it was meant to be private, a conversation between him and those who had gone ahead. But after his death, when the family went through his personal effects, they found a handwritten note with the lyrics, dated April 27th, 2025, the day after his heart had stopped, the day after he'd seen Randy. The documentary captured Ozzy's fear and vulnerability in the weeks leading up to the Back to the Beginning concert. We saw him in April, weakened and uncertain, telling the camera, "The way I feel now, it will be a miracle if I make it." We watched him research bionic legs that might help him stand, saw him contemplate whether technology could give him one last chance to be the performer he'd always been. But what the cameras didn't catch were the increasingly frequent moments when Ozzy seemed to be talking to someone who wasn't there. Amy Osbourne, who appeared in the documentary despite her famous reluctance to be filmed during the Osbournes MTV series, noticed it happening more and more frequently. Her father would be sitting quietly, and then suddenly smile at empty space, or nod as if in agreement with something only he could hear. When she asked him about it, he simply said, "They're helping me prepare, making sure I'm ready for what comes next." "Who?" she asked. "Everyone who's been waiting," he replied, and would say no more. The documentary showed us the emotional Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony in October 2024, where a supergroup of metal legends, Billy Idol, Wolfgang Van Halen, Chad Smith, Jelly Roll, Robert Trujillo, Maynard James Keenan, and Zakk Wylde, performed in Ozzy's honor because he was too weak to perform himself. We saw his heartbreak at not being able to get up from his throne and join them. What we didn't see was what happened after the cameras stopped rolling that night. Jack Black, who had introduced the tribute and rehearsed with Ozzy, stayed behind after everyone else had left the venue. He found Ozzy alone in his dressing room, still in his throne, staring at his reflection in the mirror. "You okay, Ozzy?" Jack asked gently. "You know what the funny thing is?" Ozzy replied, his voice thick with emotion. "All my life, I've been performing. From the moment I opened my mouth to sing in that church when I was a kid, terrified and barefoot, to tonight, sitting in this bloody chair watching other people sing my songs. And I've spent so much of that time being fucked up, drunk, high, depressed, angry. I wasted so much time not appreciating what I had. But you're clean now," Jack said. "You've been sober for years. Yeah, but now my body's failing me in different ways. The universe has a sick sense of humor, mate. Finally got my head straight, and now I can't make my legs work." He paused, then added quietly, "But you know what? I'm grateful for all of it, even the pain, because it taught me something I needed to learn." "What's that?" "That it's not about the performance. It never was. It was always about the connection. The moment when my voice touches someone else's heart and they feel less alone in the world. That's what mattered. That's what I need to do one more time at Villa Park. Not for me, for them, for everyone who's ever felt like an outcast, like they don't belong. I need to tell them it's okay. We all belong somewhere. This conversation, which Jack Black shared with Sharon after Ozzy's death, revealed a level of self-awareness and peace that the documentary hinted at but couldn't fully capture. The film showed us a man fighting against his body's limitations, desperate to perform one last time. What it didn't show was that Ozzy had already begun to accept his mortality, had already started making peace with the idea of letting go. Throughout May and June of 2025, as Ozzy pushed himself through physical therapy and preparation for the Villa Park concert, he began having what he described to Sharon as visitations. He would wake up in the middle of the night and find his bedroom filled with what he called presence, a feeling of being surrounded by everyone he'd ever loved and lost. His mother, Lillian, who had worked so hard in that factory to help support their family in working-class Birmingham. His father, Jack, the toolmaker who had once refused to pay young John's fine, sending him to prison for 6 weeks and inadvertently teaching him a lesson he'd never forgotten. Bandmates and friends who had died too young from the lifestyle that nearly killed Ozzy himself. And always, Randy Rhoads, the brilliant guitarist whose loss had never stopped hurting. "They're not scary," Ozzy told Sharon during one of their late-night conversations that the documentary cameras never captured. "They're peaceful, like they're all just waiting for me, telling me it's okay to let go when the time comes. But not yet, not until I've said goodbye properly." The documentary showed us Ozzy's arrival at Villa Park on July 5, 2025, the elaborate preparations, the reunion with his Black Sabbath bandmates Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward. We saw the emotions, the tears, the joy of 40,000 fans witnessing history. But what the cameras didn't capture was what happened in Ozzy's dressing room 90 minutes before he was set to take the stage. Kelly Osbourne tells the story now, with her mother's permission, as something the world needs to know. She had gone to check on her father, to help him get into his stage clothes, to make sure he was managing the pain and the stress. When she opened the dressing room door, she found Ozzy actually standing without support, in front of the mirror, his eyes closed, his lips moving in what looked like prayer or conversation. "Dad?" she said softly, not wanting to startle him. His eyes opened and he smiled at her. Not the pained, medicated smile she'd become accustomed to, but a genuine expression of pure joy. "I can feel them, Kelly," he said. "Everyone who's ever believed in me, everyone who's ever been touched by the music, everyone I've loved who's gone on ahead, they're all here. This place is packed with more than just the living. It's packed with spirits, with energy, with love that never dies." Kelly wanted to attribute it to pre-show adrenaline, to medication, to hope and nerves and the magnitude of the moment. But then she felt it too, a warmth in the room that had nothing to do with the temperature, a sense of presence that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Are you scared?" she asked. "No," Ozzy replied, and for the first time in months, Kelly believed he was telling the complete truth. "I'm ready, for tonight and for whatever comes after. I'm finally ready." The documentary brilliantly captured Ozzy's performance that night, sitting on his black throne because his Parkinson's ravaged legs could no longer support him, but singing with a power and passion that defied his physical limitations. We saw him perform War Pigs, NIB, Iron Man, and Paranoid with Black Sabbath, his voice cracking with emotion, his makeup smeared by tears, but his spirit absolutely unbroken. What the documentary couldn't show was what Ozzy saw from his throne. Multiple witnesses, band members, crew, even some fans in the front rows, later reported that during Paranoid, Ozzy seemed to be singing to someone off to the side of the stage, someone who wasn't visible to anyone else. His eyes would track movement where there was no one standing, and his smile grew wider and wider as if he was being reunited with an old friend. Tony Iommi noticed it too. It was the strangest thing, he would later tell Sharon privately. "At one point during Iron Man, I could have sworn I heard a guitar part that none of us were playing, a style that was so distinctive, so familiar. And when I looked over at Ozzy, he was grinning like he'd just heard the best news of his life. After the show, I asked him about it, and he just said, 'Randy showed up. He wouldn't miss this for the world.'" The documentary ended with the triumph of that concert, with Ozzy defying every medical expectation to perform one final time, to say goodbye to his fans properly, to fulfill the promise he'd made. The final edition, made at the family's request after Ozzy's death, showed the funeral cortege winding through Birmingham, tens of thousands of fans lining the streets, Sharon adding her pink rose to the memorial at the Black Sabbath Bridge. What it didn't show was what Sharon found the morning after the Villa Park concert, when Ozzy was back at their hotel, exhausted but at peace. On the desk in their room was a note, written in Ozzy's shaky handwriting. "I did it. I kept my promise. Now I can rest. Tell everyone I'm not afraid. Tell them I'll see them on the other side. Tell them to keep the music alive. And tell them that love, real, honest, imperfect love, is the only thing that matters in the end. Everything else is just noise." Ozzy died 17 days later, surrounded by his family, his heart giving out just as his death certificate would later confirm: acute myocardial infarction, cardiac arrest, the same heart that had stopped once before and been called back. But this time, there was no calling back. Randy's permission had been granted. The goodbye had been said. The promise had been fulfilled. In the months following Ozzy's death, as No Escape From Now was being prepared for release, Sharon debated whether to reveal these untold stories. The documentary was already so raw, so honest, so revealing. Did the world need to know about Ozzy's visions, his conversations with the dead, his spiritual awakening in the face of mortality? She decided against it, at least for the documentary itself. The film told the story that needed to be told, of a man facing his physical limitations with courage and humor, of a family supporting each other through impossible circumstances, of a legend refusing to let his story end without one final triumph. But there were things Sharon felt the world needed to understand about Ozzy, things that the cameras and microphones and interviews couldn't quite capture. The documentary showed Ozzy's pain, his depression, his moments of doubt and fear. What it couldn't fully convey was the profound transformation he underwent in those final months. From a man terrified of death to someone who had made peace with mortality, who had opened himself to experiences and beliefs he'd always been too cynical or too fucked up to accept. People think they know Ozzy because they've seen him bite the head off a bat, or stumble around drunk, or play the lovable oaf on the Osbournes, Sharon said in a private interview conducted months after the documentary's release. But that man in the last year of his life, that was the real Ozzy. Vulnerable, yes. In pain, absolutely. But also more at peace, more spiritually aware, more genuinely kind and loving than he'd ever been. The suffering stripped away all the bullshit and left the beautiful soul underneath. The documentary revealed that Kelly said Ozzy would never get over being fired from Black Sabbath in 1979, that it had destroyed him more than anything else. What it didn't reveal was that in one of his conversations with Tony Iommi during the Villa Park rehearsals, Ozzy finally addressed that decades-old wound directly. "You know, when you lot kicked me out, I thought my life was over," Ozzy told Tony while they were alone in the rehearsal space. "I was so fucked up, so angry, so convinced that I'd been betrayed by my brothers. It took me years, decades really, to understand that you saved my life." Tony was shocked. This was a conversation they'd never had, not in all the years of periodic reunions and farewell tours. "If I'd stayed in Sabbath the way I was, I would have died," Ozzy continued. "The drugs, the drinking, the depression, it was killing me, and I was too stubborn and too fucked up to see it. But getting fired, that forced me to confront myself, to either sink or swim. And yeah, I sank for a while. But then I found Sharon and Randy, and I built something new. I had a solo career that I never would have had. I had experiences I never would have had. I lived, Tony, because you lot loved me enough to let me go." Tony would later say that this moment, this reconciliation, this reframing of what had been the most painful event in Ozzy's professional life was worth every mile traveled to get to Birmingham for that final show. The documentary showed the emotion of their reunion, but it couldn't capture the depth of healing that occurred in those private moments. The documentary also couldn't show what happened with Ozzy's relationship with his oldest daughter, Amy, who had famously moved out at 16 to avoid being filmed for the Osbournes' MTV series. Her appearance in No Escape From Now was itself a revelation. The mysterious Osbourne child, who had protected her privacy for decades, finally stepping into the light. What viewers didn't know was that Ozzy's health crisis had brought about a reconciliation that went beyond what the documentary could capture. Amy had spent years feeling disconnected from her family's public life, protecting herself from the chaos and the cameras. But when her father's mortality became undeniable, she made the decision to set aside her privacy concerns and be present. In a conversation that occurred days before the Villa Park concert, Ozzy told Amy something he'd never articulated before. "I always understood why you left. I never blamed you for it. You were protecting yourself from the madness, and I respect that. I wish I'd been strong enough to protect myself sometimes. But I want you to know, you made the right choice for you, and I'm proud of the woman you became, away from all the cameras and the bullshit. You're proof that an Osbourne can be successful and private and sane. That means everything to me. This moment of validation, of a father telling his daughter that her choices had been right, even when they'd hurt him, healed wounds that neither of them had fully acknowledged existed." The documentary showed Amy's presence and her love for her father, but it couldn't convey the decades of complicated feelings that were finally resolved in those final weeks. As the one-year anniversary of No Escape From Now's release approaches, Sharon has authorized the sharing of some of these untold stories. Not to diminish the documentary, which remains a powerful, honest portrait of Ozzy's final years, but to add context, to show that there was even more to the story than 2 hours of film could capture. The documentary showed the struggle, Sharon explains, and that was important. People needed to see how hard it was, how much pain he was in, how uncertain everything was. But they also need to know that alongside that struggle was grace. Alongside the pain was transformation. Alongside the fear was faith, not necessarily in organized religion, but in something bigger than himself. The production team behind No Escape From Now has considered releasing a follow-up, perhaps titled What Remained Unseen, that would include some of this additional material. Footage of Ozzy in his quieter moments, conversations that seemed too personal or too spiritual to include in the original cut, moments of connection and healing that happened away from the main narrative of his struggle to reach the Villa Park stage. But there's debate within the family about whether these moments should remain private, sacred, known only to those who were there. Jack argues that his father's spiritual awakening in those final months would inspire people, that it would show a depth to Ozzy that the public rarely saw. Kelly worries that it would be misinterpreted, turned into clickbait, reduced to "Ozzy sees ghosts" headlines that would trivialize something profound. Sharon is still deciding. What she knows for certain is that the man who died on July 22nd, 2025, was not the same man who had nearly died in that hospital in April. The journey between those 2 points, between the first time his heart stopped and the second time it stopped for good, was about more than just physical survival or one final performance. It was about a transformation that occurred when a lifelong cynic finally opened himself to the possibility of something beyond the material world. When a man who had spent decades numbing himself with drugs and alcohol finally felt everything, including the pain, including the fear, including the love that had surrounded him all along. The documentary No Escape From Now told the story of Ozzy Osbourne's final battle and ultimate triumph. But the complete story, the one that includes Randy Rhoads appearing at his bedside, the late-night conversations with spirits, the gradual acceptance of mortality, the healing of old wounds, the discovery of faith in the midst of suffering, that story is still being revealed, piece by piece, as the family decides what their father would have wanted the world to know. What's clear is that Ozzy's final year was about more than we saw on screen. It was about a man confronting not just his physical mortality, but his spiritual reality. It was about letting go of decades of anger and pain and finding peace. It was about keeping promises to his fans, to his family, and to those who had gone before him. When Ozzy sang Paranoid for the final time at Villa Park, when he grinned at that empty space beside the stage, when he poured everything he had left into those final notes, he wasn't just performing for the 40,000 people in the stadium. He was performing for Randy, for his parents, for everyone he'd loved and lost. He was keeping his promise. He was saying his goodbyes properly. And he was showing the world that even in our darkest moments, even when our bodies fail us and our minds struggle with despair, we can find grace. That's the story that No Escape From Now told in Shadows and Implications. And that's the story that these untold chapters illuminate fully. The story of John Michael Ozzy Osbourne's final greatest transformation from the Prince of Darkness into a man who finally found his light. Thank you for reading these untold stories from Ozzy Osbourne's final year. If this deeper look into the life of a legend moved you, please show your support with a like. By engaging with these stories, you help ensure that the complete legacy of artists like Ozzy, not just their public persona, but their private struggles and spiritual journeys, is preserved and honored for future generations. The documentary No Escape from Now gave us one truth: these untold stories give us the rest. Together, they paint a portrait of a complex man who, in the end, found exactly what he was looking for: peace, redemption, and one final chance to say goodbye properly.